Hello and welcome back to the channel. So in preparation for Core 3 of the Thousand Year Blood War anime, I recently did a little rewatch of the original Bleach anime, and initially I only intended to watch the canon material as I have before. However, this time around, for some reason, I felt compelled to rewatch the filler arcs as well, and decided it might be fun to do a little video on them all. So today, I'm going to review the 4 anime filler arcs, starting with the first and probably most infamous one of them all, the Bount arc. Okay, so I know that many fans just straight up hate this one, but I gotta be honest here, I think this one is maybe a bit overhated. In fact, I'll admit that I actually somewhat enjoyed the Bount arc upon first watch. I mean, yes, there were certain episodes I didn't like, and did feel that the arc was maybe a bit too long, but overall I was fine with it. So it honestly surprised me when I found out just how disliked this one is by the Bleach fandom at large, because I don't really think it's that bad. Now, while I would never claim that it's good or great, it's definitely not the complete dumpster fire that many make it out to be. The Bount arc does have a few redeeming factors to it, the main ones being the characters of Karia, Koga, and Ichinose. These guys are the best characters here, and clearly the writers knew that because they were the ones who got the most focus. To me, Karia is not necessarily a great villain, but a good one. Initially, he comes across as a bit generic and boring, but as the story goes on, he becomes a more fleshed out character, and by the end, I'd argue that he's somewhat sympathetic. I mean, he did a lot of awful things, and his ultimate goal to destroy the Serete and everything was going a bit too far, so he's not sympathetic in that sense. However, when you look at the backstory, you can see where his bitterness and anger is coming from. Because the Bounts were treated like dirt by the Shinigami and society as a whole. But like I said, he took things way too far, which seems to be pretty in line with, well, all of Bleach's villains. But that's all I got for Karia, so let's move on to talking about Go Koga. And I have to say that he was probably the character that I liked the most from the Bount group. At first, he was more of a background character, but after his fight with Ichigo, he suddenly became a bit of a standout to me, and that definitely came from his whole backstory with Kane, which was actually pretty sad. Also, that Ichigo versus Go Koga fight was one of the better ones in this arc, just saying. But then once they're in the Soul Society, he ends up opposing Karia's ultimate plan. He's then betrayed by Karia, and then he fights Hitsugaya. And I actually enjoyed watching that series of events, and I really thought they were going to kill him off at the end, but obviously it turns out that he's still alive at the end of the story, which I was happy to see, surprisingly enough. And as for Ichinose, well, I found him annoying initially, but he grew on me as the story went. His whole backstory of hating Kenpachi because Kenpachi killed the former captain of Squad 11 was interesting, and that fight between them was honestly pretty good, and I liked his Zanpakuto ability. That was pretty unique and kinda cool. In the end though, I do wish that more could have been done with him, but he was still a pretty decent character overall. Another aspect I enjoyed is how this storyline focuses on Uryu more. Of all the main characters, he probably got the best treatment. He's basically the center here, with the Bounts wanting to use his abilities to get to the Soul Society and all that. He also has that whole struggle with not having his powers, but not wanting to be a burden to his friends either. And the interactions he had with Yoshino were nice. He also got to play a sort of big role during the final stretch, which was pretty cool. So yeah, I just really liked Uryu here. In fact, I'll admit that this arc is probably why Uryu became one of my favorite characters. So yeah, there's good stuff to be found here. However, while I can defend the Bount arc on some level, I do see where all the detractors are coming from, because unfortunately, the bad elements do kinda end up outweighing the good ones. For one, the pacing is kinda all over the place. Like, the first 4 episodes or so are just Ichigo and crew running around after those 3 mod souls, and it was just very, very boring. I mean, I get that they were setting the stage with those episodes, but there was no reason to drag it out for that long. Granted, after that the story does start to pick up some, but even then there's a lot of stopping and starting. And by that I mean that every time it felt like things were starting to go somewhere, it would slow down for an episode or so before picking back up, which became a problem in the middle section especially, and lasted all the way until the end. Like, no joke, I was pretty much over the whole entire thing by those last 10 episodes or so, and sadly, not even the fights were able to hold my interest. And that mainly came from the fact that those last few fights involved the 3 most bland and annoying characters from the Bount crew. I mean, seriously, that woman Yoshi, the old man, and that other guy Mabashi got way too much screen time for my liking. To be fair though, the fights with Kariya, Koga, and Ichinose made up for those to a degree, but still. In all honesty though, the main issue with this arc is that it is way too damn long. 45 episodes is just a bit too much, especially because this storyline isn't interesting enough to warrant that many episodes. In all honesty, 15 to 20 episodes probably would have been the ideal length here. That way, the story would have been tighter, and it wouldn't have ended up being such a slog to get through. To be fair to everyone working on the anime though, they were really just trying their best. They didn't have enough manga material to adapt at the time, so they did what they could. But yeah, that's basically all I've got on the Bount arc. Don't think it's great, but it's not the worst thing ever either. I have almost nothing to say about this one. Say what you want about the Bount arc, but at least there's stuff to talk about there. This one, on the other hand, simply exists, and if I hadn't had the idea to do this video, I would not have even bothered with it. But I should probably try to critique this one, so I will. One of my issues with the new Captain Amagai arc is, well, for one, its placement. Back when I first watched the anime nearly 2 years ago now, I recall getting kinda pissed off when this one started because it came right after the Ichigo vs. Grimmjow battle, and yeah, that's just bad placement all around. Now, since I was watching this on Hulu and not regular TV, I was able to skip it, but I'll admit that I did get a little heated for a second there. Of course, it was probably more infuriating for those who watched Bleach back when it was airing on Adult Swim or Toonami, whichever one they showed it on, since I imagine that they likely showed the episodes in order there. That's not really the biggest issue with this arc though. The biggest problem here really is the slow pacing. Now ordinarily I don't mind slow pacing, but this was downright painful. I was just so bored throughout this one, even when the story started to get really going towards the end. And in a somewhat similar vein to the Bount arc, this filler arc also overstays its welcome, once again not being substantial enough to justify the 21 episodes that it lasts for. The characters are also just okay. Princess Furicchio wasn't a bad character per se, but she was a bit annoying at times. But even so, I'd say that she was probably the character I liked the best out of the new ones. Her handlers, on the other hand, drove me crazy. I mean, I get their whole thing with protecting her and everything, but their attitude early on bugged the hell out of me, and even after they chilled out, I still didn't like them. Captain Amagai himself is fine, I guess. He's pretty bland for most of the story, mainly because he's too perfect. Now, the villain twist and his motivation helps to make him a bit more interesting, but the main problem there is that it comes just a bit too late. He's only revealed as a bad guy during the final 4 or 5 episodes, resulting in them rushing things. The redemption especially is rushed as hell, only coming about in the last 5 or 10 minutes of the final episode. And the thing is that I want to care when he dies because it is portrayed as a sad moment, but unfortunately I don't, because his redemption was so sudden and I never cared for the guy in the first place. Continuing with the characters, Ichigo, his friends, and the Gote 13 just exist in this storyline. Orihime, Chad, and Uryu get to do some stuff early on, but they ultimately get pushed aside towards the end. And as for Ruki and Ichigo, well, I don't know how they did it, but they actually made these two characters boring. No joke, the most interesting thing to happen to either of them is that episode when Ichigo is trapped by that guy and the guy messes with his memories of Misaki or whatever that was. I actually kind of like that episode, but that's it. For most of this, Ichigo and Rukia are basically bodyguards and then on the run for the last bit of the story. But that's really about it. I was gonna pick out some positives, but nothing really stood out to me that much. In all honesty though, it's not like this arc is straight up awful or anything like that. It's just that I didn't feel much of anything towards it. There's stuff I didn't care for, but there's also nothing for me to get upset about or even praise. I didn't hate this one, nor did I love it. I am, however, pretty indifferent towards it. I'm sure that this one has its fans, but personally, this is my least favorite filler arc. This one was actually fun to revisit because I remember liking this arc, but I wasn't as big of a fan as many others seem to be, and so I was interested to see if my opinion would change at all, and, well, it did, because I am now one of those people that love this arc. Writing-wise, this one is probably the most consistent and tightly written of the filler arcs so far. I get the impression that this one was planned out a bit more, as every episode uses its time to advance the story rather than padding it out. Now, of course, the previous two were probably planned out as well, but the Bount arc ended up losing its way after a while, and the Captain Amagai arc had a plot and everything, but the main issue there is that it just didn't have a particularly interesting storyline. This arc thankfully does not suffer from the same issues, which I was happy to see. I also felt that the characters were used well here for the most part. Renji gets a slightly more substantial role in one of these filler arcs. It was cool seeing him use his wits during his fight with Zabimaru, using his Porkido skills to throw them off and when that way was quite clever, and his dynamic with them was pretty funny as well. His dynamic with Byakuya gets a little bit of focus, but I do wish that Renji could have gotten more to do here since he is Byakuya's lieutenant, and they are shown to be somewhat close. Ultimately though, the writers decided to give Ichigo more attention, which, fine, Ichigo is the main character, so that's only natural I guess, but at the same time, Renji should have gotten more. But maybe that's just me. Rukia gets a few interesting things to do. She's the first one to get into a fight with her Zanpakuto, which was a surprisingly really emotional one, and her relationship with Byakuya gets some focus, though, again, not as much as I would have liked. And as for Ichigo, well, his role is more interesting at the beginning, when he has to fight Old Man Zangetsu and goes through that whole ordeal. However, once he reclaims Zangetsu, Ichigo's just kinda there. He gets into a fight here and there, interacts with Ukitake, Kyoraku, and some of the other captains, and obviously he and Muramasa have a final battle at the end, but Ichigo doesn't really do a whole lot here. But unexpectedly, the character at the center of this arc ends up being Byakuya of all characters. Of course, it was obvious to me that he was pretending to be on Muramasa's side the whole time, but it is smart that they keep you in the dark as to what his goal is until towards the end. Really though, there are so many good things to be found here, though of course, it's not perfect. For one, just like the previous arc, its placement is horrendous, coming right in the middle of a big moment in the Arrancar arc. But in relation to an actual issue within the arc itself, it does start to lose some steam after Byakuya defeats Koga. And there's also the episodes that come after Motomasa's defeat, but I'll get to that in a bit. For now, I'd like to circle back to the beginning of the arc, which was pretty strong, I'd say. Throughout the first episode, there's a small setup with the Shinigami having problems with their Zanpakutos, and then of course at the end, it pays off when Muramasa reveals himself and the Zanpakuto spears start destroying the Serete. That's a pretty good episode to start off with, and I also enjoyed the second episode as well due to its focus on Rukia. My favorite part of the early stages, though, is that whole Ichigo versus Old Man Sangetsu stuff. Like, everything that happens during this part of the story is pretty cool, and also kind of funny in retrospect once you've read and or watched the later parts of Bleach. But anyways, I don't have much of anything to say about the middle section of the arc, so I'm just gonna fast forward to the final 5 to 6 episodes when Koga is finally introduced. And I just want to say that the backstory for Koga felt kind of tragic because initially Koga was a good guy. Unfortunately, due to others' jealousy, he got accused of something he didn't do, and he then allowed his ego, bitterness, and anger to overtake him, resulting in a rampage that ended with him being sealed. This backstory also ended up making Muramasa a more sympathetic character than he initially came across. Koga became so obsessed with power that he saw Muramasa as nothing but a useless sword and treated him like trash. And then, of course, there's Byakuya vs. Koga, which is a great fight, by the way. I think it's so cool how the filler arcs actually started to step up a bit when it came to the battles. The first two had mostly really boring ones, but this arc, they did a really good job. Like, all of the battles are really good here, especially this one. Byakuya defeating Koga by working with and trusting Sinbo and Sakura was so good. Unfortunately though, after that this arc starts losing some steam, and that's because with Koga's defeat, the conflict is basically over. There's just not much left after that. I mean, there are still loose ends to tie up, of course, but I just wish that those loose ends had been more interesting to watch, because watching the Shinigami fight a bunch of hollows is kinda boring. And it doesn't help that Muramasa and Ichigo's final clash is just not great. I mean, it's not bad, but I wasn't too invested in it. I will say though, that the final moments between Muramasa and Ichigo were well done. The ending has a pretty somber feel to it, with the rain and the Zanpakuto spears disappearing. So, the arc did manage to have a very definitive, meaningful ending. Or at least, that would be the case if it weren't for the Sword Beast episodes. This mini sequel arc is not part of the main story, but they are obviously associated with each other, which is why I'm even bothering to bring them up. I didn't hate these episodes, but it's very obvious that the only reason they exist is for the sake of padding things out until the anime goes back to canon material. And this is the main reason why I basically tuned out during these episodes. I tried, but I wasn't really invested in the storylines. However, it wasn't all bad. There were a couple episodes that I liked. For example, the episode with Kazeshini was kind of cool. He gets this little character arc where he starts off wanting to fight all the time, but towards the end, he ends up protecting this baby, and that changes his viewpoint and everything. That one was kind of nice, as was the one with Snake from Zabimaru going off on his own and interacting with Ichigo's sisters, building a bit of a friendship with them. But those were the only ones I actually liked. The rest of the episodes were just okay. They weren't anything to write home about, but I also have no desire to tear them apart. And that's basically it for this one. The Zanpakuto Rebellion arc is pretty good. I enjoyed it. The Sword Piece episodes, not so much, but ignoring those episodes, I'd say that this is the best filler arc so far. But of course, there is one more filler arc to talk about, so let's get to that one. Well, we've finally reached the final filler arc of the anime. From what I can tell, this one doesn't seem to be talked about that much, which I think is sad because this one is also pretty good. In fact, I'd say that it's my second favorite after the Zanpakuto arc, which is kind of funny to say considering that I completely skipped over this one during my first watch, mostly out of frustration. See, by that point, I was so over all the filler that I went, screw it, I'm just gonna skip straight to the Fullbring arc, and I never looked back. But since I decided to make this video, I obviously had to finally sit down and give this arc a chance, and I have to say that I ended up enjoying myself a lot. Once again, you've got tight, consistent writing, good pacing, awesome fights, and the characters are well done, for the most part. However, since I've already gone on about that stuff in the previous sections, I won't really bother with any of them here, aside from the characters. Before I talk about characters though, I would like to talk a bit about an aspect of the anime that I've neglected so far, that being the animation. So up to this point, when it comes to the anime as a whole, the animation quality has been pretty inconsistent if you ask me. At times, it's been pretty good, whereas at others, it's been okay to pretty stiff. In relation to the filler arcs, the Bount arc had the worst animation, but then the Zanpakuto arc had the best. Or at least, that's how I felt until I got to the Reigai arc. Having watched this one in full now, I actually think that the Reigai arc has the best animation overlay. Now, I'm no animation expert, obviously, but I did pick up on how fluid it was and how creative they got at times with things such as POV shots. Honestly, there were even moments where I thought that maybe the animation was a bit too good, but overall I liked the animation and have no complaints with it. That's all I really wanted to say about that, though I am now gonna come back around to talking about the characters. First off, the new original characters here are pretty good for the most part. Kagerosa was a decent bad guy, I'd say. I mean, he wasn't that compelling and was pretty bland overall, but he worked and was at least somewhat intimidating. Nozomi, on the other hand, was great. She's probably the best of these original anime characters. Like, her arc is pretty good. Admittedly, it's a character arc I've seen before, but hey, I'm a sucker for stories where an emotionally closed-off character slowly but surely opens up and becomes friends with everyone. But anyways, her friendship with Kon and Ichigo especially really ended up being the heart of the story. And when it comes to the main cast, they were all used well enough, I guess. I mean, I don't have much to say about their individual contributions to the story, because aside from Ichigo himself, they were pretty much just a group the entire time. And I could complain about that, but I won't, since they at least got something to do. Like, this isn't like the first two fillers where they contributed almost nothing of worth. They all play a decently sized role here, especially at the end when trying to protect Ichigo from Yushima. And speaking of Ichigo, I really liked his role here. His whole struggle with his powers weakening while also trying to help Nozomi was interesting to follow, and I also appreciated the focus on his bond with all of his friends. However, once again, the writer surprised me by making Kon the star of this arc. Never would I have thought to make Kon the center of attention, but since multi-soul technology was important to this arc, Kon being a major focus makes sense. It was also really nice to see the more serious, caring side of the character, since he's usually nothing more than comedic relief. His bond with Ichigo is put on display here, and his friendship with Nozomi was super sweet, and I loved seeing that develop. But that's all I've really got for this section, though. I could keep going because the Reigai arc is good as a whole, but unlike the Zanpakuto arc, there aren't any moments that I want to highlight and talk about, sadly, so to finish it off, this one's good, and I definitely recommend it if you're willing to give it a try. with that, I've officially talked about all of the Bleach anime filler arcs. Didn't think I'd have so much fun talking about anime filler of all things, but I did, so whatever it was that compelled me to make this video, I'm grateful for it. It also felt nice to make another Bleach video because I haven't done one since the arc ranking video. I definitely love to do more Bleach videos, but the only problem is that I currently have no idea what specific aspects I want to cover. Hopefully I'll figure that out eventually though. But I've talked for long enough now, so I will end this video by saying that I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, that's awesome, but if not, that's cool too. I just appreciate you taking the time to listen to my nonsense. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Goodbye!